morning, everyone, or good afternoon, and welcome to our podcast, The Outlier. The Outlier is where we bring you stories untold and guests who don't follow a script. The Outlier is about the human behind the profession, the unconventional path, and the moment where everything shifted. Today, we have a very special guest, my dear friend, Dr. Dania Thafer. She is someone who built an institution in the capital of U.S. to tell the story of Gulf in her own terms. She is a policy expert, an executive director, and a scholar. She also has a book called Creative Insecurity. And if you follow this conversation, you'll know exactly why the title fits. I'm your host, Dr. Zarqa, and it's my honor to welcome my dear friend, Dr. Dania Thafer.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
I want to start by asking you the question that, rather than me defining you or reading out your bio, which is a great and very impressive bio, why don't you start us by telling us how do you want us to know you? How do you want the listeners to know you?
Well, typically people always know me by my title or my career path or whatever labeled identity that they identify me with. But actually, I like to be known as myself, Dania, not with any other affiliation, not with any label, not with my title. I think just being myself as an individual is something that I value greatly, and I also value others in that regard. For example, to me, I think you obviously have an idea of who you are or an ideal of what you should be. And for me, I think as an individual, I like to be built by certain principles that are important. And I'm not sure if I've achieved those principles, because I think in a way to say that you are these ideal principles can come off a bit arrogant, and also it's also an interaction of who you are is how people perceive you as well. And so you could have very good intentions but send very different messages. From my perspective, one principle that's important to me is, and I think maybe defining myself are probably with things that I do not like.
Okay.
So for example, one thing I don't like is arrogance. I can't stand arrogance.
That's really important.
And I'm turned off by it. Although, in our field, we have a lot of people with very big egos.
Yes. People don't know that, but that's so important to say. There's a lot of people, especially as scholars, tend to have an ego.
Yes. And so we deal with a lot of egos, people who are considered very important. And of course, I think you should respect someone in their position of authority, especially when they're in that position. But to me, if you read even religiously speaking, how did the devil become the devil? The devil said that I'm made of fire, he's made of dirt, and I'm better than him. And that's how he became the devil.
Right.
And so I think when you're arrogant, it causes a lot of other issues. And for me, for someone that has studied politics, I see arrogance is also a way to dehumanize people. And we've seen a lot of atrocities manifest out of that. So for me, even as an individual, when you're dealing with others in a simple way, I really, I can't say that I'm humble, and, I don't say that I'm that important, but I always
try. But you are important.
Thank you. I guess that's a perception. But the issue is that I judge people a lot by how they treat the person that they can't get nothing in return from.
Yes.
And I think that's something that's really important. I also value honesty. And honesty to me is a wide net, and for me, it's not just just saying a fact. It's also hiding facts, for example. And now I'm not talking about privacy. Privacy is one thing.
Yes.
But to me, if people are just fundamentally dishonest about different things at different levels, I think it just builds this barrier that you can never overcome.
Right.
And so for me as a person, I always try to be honest with people. It's quite interesting. Now, you asked about how I would like to be defined. And one thing that I don't like, and I know I started out with all these things I don't like, but actually how you become yourself is a reaction to different things around you.
Right.
So one thing to me is labels. I've been labeled my whole life.
Yes.
From my kindergarten until now. In the East and in the West, I've been labeled as, an identity and boxed into it. And it usually happens within the first couple of minutes.
Yes.
And so this is why it's really important that people know me as an individual, of what I stand for, the values I stand for, rather than placing me within a positionality of a given society. So like, for example, in the East, people love to tell you, like, okay, who's your family? And they place you within that.
Within that box.
Or whether, what's your marital status? And you're placed within that.
Right.
I think, like, in the West, it's always like, what have you accomplished? What's your career? What's your title? In the West, for example, people... First of all, I never tell people about my career when I first sit with them, if I don't know them.
How do you do that when you're so popular?
Well, I'm popular in Gulf affairs. I'm not popular in every affair.
Right.
So I don't tell people. I usually sit in the room. I'm usually quite quiet about my career and everything. And I just want to see what kind of bias people have towards me. Generally speaking, in the West, they're shocked. Like, wait.
Yes.
You are wearing a hijab and you've written a book, or you lecture students, or you speak on platforms. I think that's really hard because the media has painted women in hijab, and I purposely wore hijab. I didn't have to wear hijab in the West because they've painted women in hijab as these backwards, like, oppressed women who, the men in their family define who they are and force them to wear this hijab.
Yeah.
And so I just let them come up with their biases towards me, and then I just throw it at them all of a sudden. Like, I've done XYZ, and they're like, no way. How did you do it? I mean, I had a professor, I won't name him, who's just told me, you're like an oxymoron. Like, you cannot, your qualifications as a scholar or as an intellectual don't match your appearance. And he meant that as a compliment. So these are kind of responses that I get, and this is why I've never liked labels. I've at my own, like at the institute, for example, in which I have a great team, and this is why I have an institute. People have come up to me and they're like, so how do you like your internship?
How do you like your internship? I'm sorry, do they think you're an intern?
Yeah, people think I'm an intern because I may look young,
or you may look a certain way. Yeah,
and I'm just like, well, I was the founder, but okay, thank you. So that's kind of like what I talk about, the labels, like the labels regards your age, the label in regards of being a woman. So it's been kind of an interesting balance. In being between a society that you're defined by your social role and a society that you're defined completely by your career path. And I actually prefer not to be defined by either. I prefer to be known for who I am.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, everything you've said is so correct, and at some level, I can completely relate to it. You said you don't like labels, and I completely get that. But I think we live in a society where people like to identify, like either here in the East or wherever society we go into. But there's this idea, especially if you're a young woman scholar, that you're meant to be a certain way. You can either be a woman scholar of a certain age or a certain ethnicity, or you can be a Muslim woman. And so it's very difficult, at least from my own experiences, to you never, like, I personally actually never want to prove anything, but I think it gets very difficult to, at one point, to do what you do, and then also not be impacted by the ways in which you're perceived, because that perception also impacts what kind of opportunities you get and what kind of doors open up for you and what kind of seats you get on the table. And I know it can be difficult. And in fact, I want to tell a story about how I met Dr. Dania. I met her, I think it was right before COVID in 2019, I think, online, because she's the founder of Gulf International Forum in DC. And she was one of those people who just reached out to me and several of other junior, at that point I was still a PhD student, several other local scholars. And I found that she was so kind and so approachable. And I was shocked in a positive way, because I wasn't used to having a woman, or having a woman, first of all, be so kind and so down to earth, given the work that you do. I wasn't surprised that you're a scholar, because I think I've seen so many Muslim scholars, or scholars from this part of the world or from the global south. But, and of course, people in the West don't know that. But what I found very, very interesting about you, Dr. Dania, was that you were so honest and you were so kind and approachable. And you mentioned that you value values. How do you, like, before I get into the institution, I want to talk about, like, how do you maintain that character and that dignity and that kindness, which people can easily mistake for weakness? And also in societies abroad, like in Western societies, but even other societies, this idea of being professional and strategic, where you have to be very calculated and, you know, every move has to be very strategic. How do you maintain that kind, warm personality along with your scholar and official persona?
Well, as I mentioned to you, the thing that I was a fledgling once in my career. And I think when you go into other arenas outside of your zone in your career, you are a fledgling. So you remember that. And then I also remember when I was no one going to DC, I mean, no one in terms of career-wise. We're always someone, right?
Yes.
But when I went to DC and I was not known in my field and I was young and I was a hijabi and I was the only hijabi working in the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., I remember all those people who were kind to me and supported me the most people that I've admired throughout my career were the people that were successful and always had a strong grounding in values and how they treated others. And so I've always wanted to maintain that. Now, I wouldn't mistake my friendliness as, for example, being naive or as like someone that's easy to push around. Yeah.
It's a strength.
Yeah, I mean, some people think that it's a weakness when you're friendly or approachable.
Yes.
But the truth is, I think it's much harder to be friendly and strong than strong and have a wall up.
Yes, that's very easy to do, to have a wall up.
Yeah, the wall up is very easy to do. I think what's important is always to have boundaries with people in general, like whether personal or professional. Yeah. I mean, you can make your boundaries clear, but also be someone that is kind and that gives back.
Yes. I think that's beautifully said. I think it is so, and I often think about that is the kind of legacy that I will have, or the way people treat you is their legacy. You know, it could be positive legacy or negative legacy. And I often find that the legacy is not the achievements, it's the kindness, like you said. And that's why what I remember about you from the very beginning is the kindness and the warmth, and it was an energy that I felt. It was online, and I was actually meant to be at MISA, a Middle East Studies Association, and we actually couldn't meet because there was COVID. But I felt through our online meetings that you were very kind and very warm. Now, I want to turn the question a little bit to the institution that you built. Now, you built a very important institution in Washington, D.C. You built the Gulf International Forum in the heart of American capital. Tell us a little bit about that. Like, why did you choose to build that institution, and why in DC?
Well, DC is a very interesting town. It's the center of world politics, whether people like it or not.
Yes, it certainly is the center of world politics.
Yeah, and growing up in the U.S. and being from the Gulf, I've always had to explain the region. And I will tell you, when I started out in pursuing a career in researching the Gulf, I remember my professors, most of them were specialized in the Levant. And at the time, Israel-Palestine was a major issue. Egypt was huge.
Right.
So there was a lot of focus on other parts of the region. And the Gulf was not a popular area of research. And my professors told me, they were like, well, why are you so interested? They're just these 6 monarchies with a lot of oil and, no politics, no domestic politics. I mean, that's actually kind of the answer that I got from many professors.
That is such an Orientalist answer. And it surprises me because that perception continues till the day, by the way.
Yes, I do think so as well. Yeah. So I found myself always advocating for the Gulf, because if you go in the U.S., so the most of the people from the region that live in the U.S. are unfortunately a lot from countries that have been in some form of war. They're refugees that have been displaced. And so they have huge families and subcultures, but there's no Gulf subculture in the U.S.
Really?
And that's what makes it interesting. It's almost like, I was just by myself kind of just talking about the Gulf to different people, whether it be within these subcultures, whether it be within the West, whether it be in intellectual circles. And I think it almost developed into a career, because I originally was going towards finance and working in New York in a finance field, which is completely different. And then I realized, well, maybe I don't want my career to be about increasing shareholder wealth. There's more I can do. And so it just developed into a passion. And from there, it developed into a career. Now the Gulf, we're talking about the 2010s, where the Gulf became much more important globally from a financial investment perspective, and also regionally when there were all these vacuums across the Middle East.
There was the time of the Arab Spring.
Right. And now what you had was many people wanted to understand the Gulf, but there was not enough experts when it came to Gulf affairs.
Right.
And so this is kind of where Gulf International Forum came. But it wasn't just an institute to try to understand the Gulf from the lens of oil or gas or just, Iran and security issues related to Iran, today. Yeah. And I won't say that we're not sucked into those conversations, because they reoccur all the time. Yes. But we also like to add a lot of flavor from the region, like the perspectives from the region on how Gulf affairs are important in the region, within the countries themselves, and globally speaking, and to the U.S.
Yes.
And I think this is one of the reasons I started this institution, is because it came to be natural to me to talk about the Gulf and the U.S., especially being between both societies all my life.
So this is very, very interesting. And I agree with you that I think we were undergrad students, me and you, around the same time, but I was also a undergraduate student in 2010s. And then throughout that time period, and even before that, there was this idea, like you said, that either one, that Gulf is not that relevant, like globally, and then or in intellectual spheres. But then, ironically, there were quite a few experts on the Gulf, and then the things that we were looking at were, like you said, just finance, economy, rentier economy, and those terms that always pop up. When you created this institution that you did, Gulf International Forum, which I think is an excellent venue, and I know that you engage with a lot of local regional scholars as well as scholars globally, which I think is really important for us to have different perspectives. How do you think, in what ways were you able to kind of create new pathways for studying the Gulf beyond the the perception that it's an oil rent economy, or that these are small states. To what extent do you think that you were able to and how do you, like, what was your vision for creating those pathways? I can't imagine that was an easy thing to do.
Well, it has been quite interesting adventure. And, these conversations are not only nested in Washington. So Gulf International Forum became much more of a global entity in terms of its programming. So we've been now in Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, in the Gulf. So that's one way in which we've changed the framing of the conversation and the understanding of the Gulf. But also when you have individuals from the region explaining how the region views the situation, that also creates a learning experience for those in the West and in other regions to understand what are the perspectives from the region, but not also on these major issues as well. How they view those relations, for example, with the U.S. or the West, and what are the perceptions of the U.S. and how does that affect U.S. Gulf policy?
Right.
We have so many different kinds of programs. We have programs about education in the Gulf, and we have programs about the societies of the Gulf. And we have programs, and we have policy-oriented programs, and we have academic-oriented programs.
Right.
And so we try to influence the knowledge production in both arenas. So, for example, the Gulf Studies Symposium is supposed to be more geared towards the academic side and has different angles and more long-form assessments versus our policy conference or off-the-record discussions. And I think what makes us unique, I think we're the only institution that has such close connections with the region.
Right.
Most of the institutions, and actually Washington has changed a little bit more, having, I think, less voices from the region over the last couple of years. So it does pave way for us to play more of a role in that type of engagement.
Right. And I think one of the perhaps benefits is that the sphere of engagement has shifted. Like, it's not just in person. Like, I know a lot of your events are online as well. So I think that kind of broadens the audience. And I know that you did a lot of great discussions even during COVID when traveling was not possible. And so I think that was really great. And so what I want to just talk a little bit about also is, you mentioned that you engage a lot of Gulf scholars with the American scholars or global experts. To what extent does that visibility matter? Because I think, at least for me personally, like, there are all these spaces or like these conferences where you go to and you would meet like a handful of Gulf experts or Gulf scholars. But what you do, and I think it's really important, is that you've brought different stakeholders who are not necessarily just like professors or academics, that you bring different stakeholders. I think there are people who are like, in politics, or even like sometimes I see like ex-diplomats, business people in the business community. I've seen a large diversity of people that you bring in. Do you do that intentionally? And what is that visibility and that positionality, just beyond the topics that they discuss, but some of them, the way in which they represent themselves, what does that do to like this global framing of how the world views the Gulf?
Well, this is a great question. And to me, this kind of work, in a way, is like art.
It really is.
It is, because you're framing narratives, you're bringing different views. We always try to have more than one country view at the table when we work. And it's also about bringing the right voice at the right time, who would be able to highlight all the different angles that are important to understanding a given issue. And interestingly enough, as someone who's been in the media quite a lot, in some ways, I think having a think tank and having these sort of different forums, in a way, is like the media in some ways.
But I do agree with you that mainstream media is no longer the main source of like information or intellectual discussions, at least not for me. Yeah.
And so, the ideas that come out of the different programs, the personalities that sit at the table. I mean, those are not all coincident. And let's say even when we had the Gulf was divided during the Gulf crisis, we tried to bring the different voices in different ways. Not necessarily if two countries won't sit with each other at the same table.
Right.
We bring a voice that kind of showcases the view of that country. So what we've been trying to do at the forum is to stay above the fray of all the different divisions within the region and perspectives, and kind of showcase all of the diverse views that are there at one table.
Right.
We've done it successfully many times. Of course, we've stumbled a lot of other times.
I can imagine that it's not an easy task. But what I have to say is, and I agree with you, I think that you've managed to give a great diversity of views, and that is amazing, and I applaud you on that. But I also agree with you that it is an art to create different narratives online and to how you bring people together. It really is an art, and it's an art on how to kind of create that space online, because a lot of like what we do now, whether it's knowledge production, and I'm coming to that in a minute, or whether we do research or whether we do these public events, I think there's one aspect of creating that product or creating that knowledge, but then the other is dissemination, and how do we kind of put it forward to the world. And that is changing. I think knowledge production is not like how it used to be. And research is certainly not being perceived how it used to be. And this is where I want to talk about, I know you produced a really important piece of literature, which is your book. Well, I know you've done a lot of other important researches, but I think the book itself is very important. The creative insecurity. Tell us a little bit, just in a nutshell, where did that idea come from, and how did your work at the Gulf Forum inspire that?
Well, this project was something that I was interested in. I felt like the Gulf is approaching an important critical juncture. As you know, there's large youth populations. The Middle East has the youngest population in the world. And then we're approaching the fourth industrial revolution.
Right.
Obviously, before AI came very popular, I started writing this because it took many years to do the research for it. But I saw that we were approaching the fourth industrial revolution, where technology is going to redefine society.
Right.
And then the big question was about the climate issue and renewables and the future of hydrocarbons.
Yes.
And so all of these three issues in confluence really affect the Gulf states and their visions and the way they were moving forward. And so I wrote this book to address these kind of issues from a certain angle, and how are the Gulf states going to integrate their youthful populations in the private sectors, and what are some of the political and institutional obstacles for that.
Well, I want to say that, I don't have the book with me right now, but we're going to put it up for you in the link as we post this episode. I think it's a really important piece of literature. And I'm not just saying that because Dr. Dania is a good friend. I actually think it's a really important piece of literature on the Gulf, regardless of who wrote it. But I also think positionality matters. So I think that everything she just said, the concept of fourth industrial revolution, the technology, youth, I think that's really important to highlight that this region has one of the highest youth populations. And so this is really important. And I know, why I think this, one of the reasons why I think this book is important is because I know that you don't simplify things. You always give us the way it is. So it's even if it's complex. Now, we know that you've made a lot of media appearances, and I think that's great. You've appeared on New York Times, Financial Times, and several other really important media outlets. And I am actually happy that they're bringing someone, at least now, who, is from their region, but has also seen, lived and worked in different other parts of the world. And so tell us that why do you always give us the real story rather than just simplifying facts?
Well, I'll tell you something interesting about the media, which is, sometimes, you want to pitch a piece to write. And the media, generally speaking, they like these very catchy arguments that are kind of black and white in order to get clicks. Because people in general, they like this kind of perspective. And I think that's the hardest thing for someone like me who sees the Gulf states not as a monolith. I mean, I've been to all of them. I know people from all of them. My heritage is from the Gulf. And so I'm always having, but if, maybe, no, in this scenario, well, you're assuming this. And the media is like, just say it, tell it very quickly.
Give us a quick line,
I think that's...
Give us a script.
That's the hardest part, to try to do that. So trying to balance between distilling information for the media, but also having that degree of detail that actually showcases the perspectives of those different countries. And this happened over and over, even during this war. I was always asked, like, well, how are the Gulf states going to respond to this? I'm like,
you mean which state?
You mean in 2 minutes you want me to tell you how 6 states are responding to this?
Absolutely.
And I think that's something that should be worked on in the media, of course. And I also really like pieces that focus maybe on individual countries or 1 or 2 countries than the 6 countries at once. Because finding the common denominator for all 6 countries, I think, is very hard.
It is.
But so I've always refused that by trying to give as much detail as possible. But
but I want to also commend you, because I think you've been very generous with your time, and then you've, like you said, like media, especially mainstream media nowadays, I think they know that they have to operate online. It's not like the typical broadcasting routine. So they're able to find these amazing people like you because of your visibility online, etc. But I think it's also not easy to be brought in and then to be a spokesperson of like a very broad and diverse region, which is still perceived as one monolith, as you said. And to be able to do that and to still give them the representative view and to say no when you really believe it's a no, and to then give them what you really think is the answer is not easy to do. I personally, by the way, have said no to a lot of interviews because I don't think that I can actually always come out and say whatever I want to say within a given script. But you do that really well sometimes, and I applaud you for that. But then how do you deal with that pressure, because I can imagine many different media outlets have their own narratives, and sometimes you can't cross that narrative. It requires a lot of strategy and strength.
I think you have to know the audience and know the outlet. And I will go to a lot of outlets I don't agree with all the time.
That's very important.
And actually that's something that I think is really important. I noticed a lot of people tend to avoid places that they disagree with, and I understand why. And there are good reasons to have strong disagreements with places and boycott them.
Right.
But I also go on outlets that I don't agree with their narratives. They can't necessarily go completely against my principles, but and I do that because this is my opportunity to frame the narrative and to give a point. That generally I wouldn't be able to speak to that audience. And also different audiences focus on different things, right?
Yes.
Like audiences in the region, they emphasize on certain things that are important to them, audiences in the West. And so being able to speak to them in their language, I think is something that has been valuable in the media. But, I think maybe in this crisis, I have been extremely active in the media. Sometimes I push back, like I don't want to be in the media. It was just because of because it can be very time consuming and disruptive, because they contact you at all hours, day and night.
The work never stops.
You always have to respond right away. So it can be a bit disruptive, but I do think there are times where it's really important that you should be talking to the media, depending on obviously your role and what you're doing and what's the situation, of course.
So I want to say that this is not an easy job, and I want to acknowledge that. I think a lot of people think that as academics, we have more flexibility, but I know that you're beyond an academic, you're also a policy expert. And so this kind of job is like 24 hours. You really don't ever stop. So this is really not easy. I want to ask you on that note, everything that you've done and built with so much value and character, what advice would you give to a woman in her 20s who wants to build something?
First, something that I needed to bring to your attention. It's true, I built the institution, but I had so many supporters. And actually, I could have never done anything that I did without my team. And number one thing I think is missing is that, and obviously there are different views and philosophies about leadership. And I'm not one to, tell people how they should lead institutions. But you're as good as your team.
Right.
And so
that's a really important advice I've heard today.
Yes, you're as good as your team.
Yes.
And the fact is, if you are, I've seen many times where leaders don't want to have people work with them that could outshine them in some ways. Right. But actually, your team is what brings you forward and makes you what you are. And everything that I've achieved, I've had mentors, I've had so many supporters. I wish I could name them all. Yes. But a lot of them are actually very humble people and don't like to be named in public spheres. So I want to give gratitude and credit where it belongs. Now, in terms of a young woman in her 20s,
yes.
Risk-taking is really important for success. I know it's hard. And putting yourself out there and getting rejected a lot.
Yes. Rejection is not easy to take at all.
But it's a big part of success.
Now I see it as it's just a redirection. Like now I know if something doesn't work out, it's just something better is coming my way. It's not aligned with me.
Yeah. And I think, especially when you're younger, you can take a lot more risk because you have less responsibility. And more flexibility. Although I think younger people are always worried about what's happening next. So, most of my students at Georgetown in DC, they're always like, well, I have to secure my internship for this summer and my job for the next, and my GPA has to be this because I have to go to this grad school and that. And I think they don't reflect a lot on the moment that they're in, the freedom that they have to
absolutely agree with you,
to be creative. To take risk. Also, I think building confidence, sure, confidence can come intrinsically in some ways.
Yes.
But also building confidence is you try something and then you build the confidence the second time around.
Right.
So
I agree with you.
Yeah, even in Gulf International Forum, let's say, we've had so much trial and error and awkward moments and situations, but you learn from those things. And I think when you're young, a lot of young people in some ways try to be perfect, try to pretend they know everything.
Yes, especially in today's day and age.
I was guilty of that too when I was in my 20s. But the truth is, you learn through experience, and experience is actually what shapes you. And when you told me to define myself, I define myself through so many experiences and failures and successes and all of that. And I think that someone young should really think about how she has everything ahead of her. Yes. And that, I know it's really hard, that society can be something very difficult to deal with, whether you're in the West or the East.
Yes.
But, you don't necessarily have to be defined by, what society says you should be. You don't have to fit that mold. Yes. I'm not saying, flip it upside down and go against society. But, pursue your passion, what you like, and take risk, fall, cry, eat that bucket of ice cream, watch Netflix, and then get up the next day and move forward. And I think that's the problem. I think people are so risk averse and afraid to fail, but failure is part of growing and learning and being successful.
Thank you so much. I think that was beautifully said, and I agree with you. I think, I say that now, but I think some of the best moments of of my career as an early PhD student and early career scholar was taking risks. And even before that, like taking risks, not getting what you wanted, trying out new things. I think that was such an important part of the story. And I wouldn't trade that for anything else. And talking to you today, I think it makes a lot of sense that those are the moments that I think you said led you to where you are today. Now, we want to have a long conversation with you, but as one of the last questions I want to ask you is, now, given that where you are, and I think it's a really successful place to be at, did you always know that your path was going to be unconventional, or that you were going to create this path? Or how did you vision yourself to be?
I don't know about unconventional, but since I was young, they used to call me the businesswoman with no business. So
this is why you're the perfect fit for this podcast.
Yeah, so basically even in undergrad, I was the congresswoman in my class.
Right.
But I also started little groups and institutions.
Yes.
I was always involved in my community. I've started businesses and they didn't work out when I was in undergrad.
Yes.
So I kind of was always entrepreneurial. I think the entrepreneurial part comes with taking this role. And actually, believe it or not, I think people generally see me as a scholar because they see my output or an expert, and my output, my analysis, my books, or whatnot. But actually, that's like 20% of what I do. Mm-hmm. Most of my work is like looking at how to, work on the institution. What's our next program? What's happening? What stakeholders should we know? Who should I be meeting with? So there's a lot of other considerations. Did I take the best path forward? I'm not sure. It's not an easy path, and it's a struggle. But it has been enjoyable and rewarding because it's something that I've been passionate about and something I think that defined me as a person. And actually, a lot of people told me when I moved to DC, they said, "Why don't you just take the hijab off? You'd be so much more successful if you didn't wear the hijab." Wow. And I was like,
so that was
it's an identity thing.
It's an identity thing, absolutely.
It's a little strange being here in the region because everyone wears hijab, so you kind of just. But in the U.S., you always kind of stood out in the group,
right?
And there were so many different judgments that are placed on you, and everyone was like, you could have just taken the hijab and just been very successful in Washington rather than taking this really awkward path.
Wow.
But anyways, I thought it was rewarding. It was a great exercise as for me, intellectually speaking, socially speaking. It was an experiment, and I'm glad that it worked out.
It really worked out, and I'm glad you did it the way you did
it.
But
it doesn't always work out. There's a lot of, I have to say, struggles before something works out. And I just think people just think you're going to get that position and you're just going to go up. And that's not necessarily how life works.
Absolutely. I think with being, I think we all have different layers of identities. And depending on where you are, which part of the world or which moment in time you are, that identity, kind of highlights. And I often find that also as somebody who's Western educated, but based in the Middle East, it's just like if you fail, it's your personal failure. But if you are successful, it's because of something, the institution or something, like everybody wants to claim responsibility for your success. But the failure or being made invisible or being constantly somebody who's being boxed, that is all on you. Like, why don't you do that? If you did that differently, and I think it's beautiful to talk to you about that today. And I certainly agree with you. I've come to the very hard realization that I'm not changing anything about my identity as a Muslim woman. And I think partly for me is because I saw many successful, amazing Muslim women who did not see because religiosity is your personal thing, but it's your appearance as a Muslim woman. And it was never an obstacle to them. And again, maybe because I grew up mostly in the region. So, But I know that it's not easy because I've had several of those moments, and which is why I want to applaud you again for doing all the great work that you did. So before we end this podcast, Dr. Dania, I want to ask you, how would you like to describe yourself in one word? And I'm laughing because I know it's not easy.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you named this podcast The Outlier. And I actually, you know, that is a pretty good description of me.
Oh, wow.
I've always been kind of that in-between person, you know, not this or that. And I've grown to be very comfortable to be that in-between. And as I, you know, studying statistics, as somebody who, you know, political science has gone very quantitative.
Right.
But we can go to basic statistics and, you know, there's that bell curve.
Yes.
And then you have, in the middle, you have the, you know, all the average, the dots that are all in the middle, and then you have that little dot in the corner. It's the outlier. And you want to understand how that outlier actually, in some ways, is very interesting because it moves the curve a little bit if you have many outliers. That's how the curve moves. But I always wanted to study the outlier, not the average in the middle.
Well, me too.
But stats doesn't teach us that. But
Well, this is very interesting because this is exactly why you were the right person for this podcast. And I'm glad that you know, that outlier or however you want to describe it, has helped you create something that, you know, showed us that the path doesn't have to be straight or conventional to lead to something amazing. And what I find really interesting about outliers is that it's the outlier that helps us study the frame or maybe redefine the frame. And thank you so much for coming to our podcast, sharing your story with us and showing us that what it means to build a room before you enter that room. And that's exactly, to me, what the outlier is all about. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today. Please share the story if this resonates with you, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.